So welcome to Novi Sad and welcome to the second Polyglot Conference. I'm glad to see you all here, and I know it's been a fun time so far. So we'd like to kick off with the first presentation. So I want to introduce Vanja Kovic, who's going to talk about neural... I'm going to read this out and try and do my best. A nice long title in Serbian, which translates into English as Neural Representations of Sound Symbolism and Conceptual Organization. Did I do well? Yes. Thank you. So without further ado, please, Vanja, take the stage.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank organizers for inviting me to be part of this really, truly nice event according to the program that I had a chance to see. It's a pleasure to be here, and just to say that I come from the University of Belgrade, Department of Psychology, and just to give you a glimpse from which perspective I come, I'm actually experimental psychologist. And yes, I decided to do this combination of speaking in English and having my slides, lecture slides in Serbian, so hopefully that will be a good combination for everyone here, hopefully I say. And given that I'm experimental psychologist, today I will actually start with an experiment, which I'll tell you in a second. Just before that, I wanted to tell you that I'm very much interested in language, but language from the neural perspective. How exactly is language organized and how is it processed on a brain level? And today, I decided to tackle it actually from the examples of both sound symbolism and semantic organization, and I'll be showing you some new data that we actually collected in Serbian language. So, as I promised, to start with an experiment, I promise it's a very simple one. If you have seen it before, please don't participate, okay? So, I'm going to ask you a very simple question, and that is, when I show you these two labels, Takete and Maluma, which of these two objects you would, relate them to? So, you have a left one and a right one, Blobly and Jaggedy. So, if you don't mind, please raise your hand if you think that Maluma is to the left and Takete is to the right. Right. And who would go for Maluma to be to the right? Wow, okay. So what we just did is replicated a really robust finding which was first reported by Keller. And that is to say that people really tend to pay attention to some correspondences which exist between labels that we use to basically mark different things around us and the objects around us. Now this is, notice please, truly artificial language, and in this artificial language there are variations of such. So people would use different kind of shapes, but they would also use different labels such as Buba and Kiki. And again, here I thought we had a 100% Maluma Takete. Usually it's between 95 to 98 percentages, so very, very high. So if we are to talk about language as an arbitrary system, your responses should be 50-50 pretty much, right? So we would be choosing by chance which one we would call Takete and which one we would be calling Maluma. And here we have a really robust finding. Similarly, if you were to ask people, imagine now that you see a really big table and then a really small one, and which labels you would attach to them, offered two, Mal and Mil. Again, you would have Mal to refer to a big one and Mil to refer to Mal one. So shape, size, and different kind of things regarding artificial language structure can be really nicely captured within this sound symbolic framework. And not only these kind of labels, but I'll show you just a few types of research collected in this field. For instance, Westbury and his colleagues were presenting specific phonemes, so not labels, not words, but specific phonemes within a context, within a framework for which they thought would be more appropriate or less appropriate to the presented word. So O, letter O, would actually go better within a rounded framework, of course, rather than in jaggedy. And their predictions were that people would be more accurate and more precise, more quick, sort of to say, when they're processing these kind of letters within a congruent framework. And clearly, this is exactly what they did in their research. And then fairly recently, like about 10 years ago or so, it was documented that even children, 2.5-year-old children, would actually demonstrate exactly the same preference as you did just a few minutes ago. They would similarly choose Buba and Kiki or Maluma and Tekete to refer to Blobly and Jaggedy shape respectively. And not only children, 2.5-year-olds, but also like even younger kids would go for under, believe it or not, under 1 year, they would still show these kind of preferences when it comes to size and shapes of the objects. Also, very importantly, it has been shown, and this is really a recent study by Bremner and his colleagues, that this effect is very, very independent from cultural or linguistic background. So even with the tribes which do not use orthographical systems, you still find these kind of preferences. And together with my ex-mentors, professors from the University of Oxford, a few years ago, we managed to demonstrate that with the artificial material, our brain shows sensitivity to sound symbolism within 200 milliseconds. So this is a fifth of a second from the moment you show the object to the participant. So these are really very, very robust findings. And you would all agree they are questioning this well-known theory posed by Saussure, which says that language is an arbitrary system. So the question is it really? And so when we think about labels and how well do they match objects around us, it really is a question how much in a natural language we rely or we do not rely on sound symbolism. So really, is it appropriate to call chair, or stolica in Serbian for that matter, or table, stone, and so on? Are there really natural correspondences even in a natural language? That is a question. And now most of the people, particularly linguists and most of the psycholinguists would say clearly no. There are no clear correspondences. And most of the people would agree with that. Clearly, I mean, it really doesn't seem like we are relying on these correspondences much in language. When it comes to studies in natural language, there are many, many few. I told you that there are a number of studies which are done on artificial language, confirming over and over again what we demonstrated now about 10 minutes ago, what exactly is happening with sound symbolism and artificial material. But what about natural language? Now, there are a few studies, but just a simple example of experimental work, and I'll just briefly tell you about it before I move on to my research. So there is this study which includes English participants who do not speak Japanese language, and they get them to guess the meaning of Japanese words. And if they had any sound symbolism within them, the percentage of guessability of the meaning of the words was much, much higher. So again, from 50%, you would move it to 70 or even up to 80, which is quite impressive. But then also, there are examples of sound symbolism recorded in many, many languages. Here in this study, which is now quite old, in over 200 word languages. However, as I told you, there is only so far published single experimental work regarding sound symbolism. And when we look at that work, it's again Westbury and his colleagues. So similarly to what you saw before, when they presented single phonemes within a jaggedy or blobby shapes, and they actually found the effect of sound symbolism, when they did the same thing with words, so when they present balloon within quite roundy space and then balloon with quite roundy, jaggedy space, they didn't get an effect of sound symbolism. No effect whatsoever. So people are not faster or more accurate when you present appropriate framework for the objects that they're processing. So for me and for my research group now in Belgrade, this was the starting point because that was a single experimental work reported so far. So we started analyzing the work by Westbury, and first thing which really struck us was that they were using what we call in psychology really long interstimulus interval. So what they would do is to present participants with a framework, which would be either rounded or blobby. So this is the one that I'm talking about. And then after that, after 1 to 4 seconds, they only then would actually present a word. So count 1, 2, 3, 4, it's a really long period, especially when it comes to language processing on a neural level. And just remember what I told you before, that on an artificial material, we found out that our brain is sensitive to sound symbolism really early on. Like it takes 200 milliseconds only to process it. So this was the first starting point for us. We thought, okay, maybe it's really not to do with the fact existing or not existing, but the design of this particular study, which is the only one in literature that people are referring to. So the first thing that we did is actually to kill this huge gap, 1 to 4 seconds. So we were presenting those two stimuli simultaneously. So the name would appear within a framework at the same time. And so we chose about 50 words which sounded soft and which were actually either soft or round in Serbian, such as balon, which was very similar in English, balloon, or ball, and so on and so forth, within a rounded but also within a jaggedy context. Similarly, we presented a very edgy words, such as šiljak, within both round and jaggedy framework. And our prediction clearly was that you would process šiljak much faster if it's presented within very edgy context as opposed to blobly context and vice versa. We also used 50 plus 50 pseudo words which were matched to the words that we use. And so what did we observe? No effect. Was Westbury right? So it really doesn't matter whether it's congruent or incongruent form when it comes to sound symbolism. It takes exactly the same or pretty much the same amount of time to process the object within either blobby or jaggedy shape, doesn't really matter. And similar for the pseudo words. A little bit disappointing for us, according to our predictions and hypotheses. However, when we looked at the accuracy with which people did this, we actually saw that people were much less accurate, of course, with pseudo words as opposed to words, but then also they were much less accurate with incongruent as opposed to congruent condition. So this is to present balloon within edgy shape, and this is to present balloon within rounded shape. People are much more accurate if you actually have appropriate or a sound symbolic organization of a presentation. So then we thought, okay, this is promising. Could it be that even presenting them simultaneously, when you're measuring it only with the reaction time, and it takes people like at least a second to push the button to decide what is presented on a screen, maybe that's also too long. What can we do? Well, we need a much more precise measure. So what we decided to do is to run this study using ERP methodology. Now, ERP methodology, anyone who's familiar? How many of you? Okay, so I'll just give a brief background. ERP methodology is similar like an EEG. I'm sure that all of you heard about EEG. So just to put it really simple, EEG is tracking what's happening at the brain level in terms of milliseconds. So every single second, we know what exactly is happening at the brain level in terms of amount of electricity. Again, I'm simplifying the story. In terms of amount of electricity produced. Of course, if there is more processing going on, there will be more sort of, to say, electricity in that region at that particular moment. So this is exactly methodology that we wanted, because this gives us a possibility to really look into the brain and see how quickly people are reacting, if at all, there is a difference between sound symbolic and non-sound symbolic congruencies. So basically what happens is you attach a few electrodes or channels to participant's scalp, you send that signal through the amplifier, and you record it on a monitor. Again, I'm really simplifying the story, but I'm more than happy to tell you more about what exactly is happening if you're interested. So that much just as a background regarding methodology. So when we applied this methodology within our study, again, by measuring now the amount of electricity produced at the brain level millisecond by millisecond, and presenting the same stimuli that I told you before, so balloon and šiljak and all these words within blobby and rounded shapes, what we got? Recording from all these kind of sites. There were 15 electrodes that we were using, distributed according to international ICI system. we actually had to process data heavily. And now again, if you want to know more about this, I'm more than happy to tell you about it, but this is not a topic about methodology. So you need to make sure that data is filtered, so it's not picking any of other electrical noise in the surrounding. You need to take only those frameworks where you actually have processing of the data. Then also to correct the baseline, to make sure that there are no eye blinks in the data because they really mask the effects on the brain level, so on and so forth. Just to keep it short, after that we do the grand average. So we want to see what is the typical response to sound symbolic as opposed to non-sound symbolic combination when you present it to the people. And so what we got as an effect is, to start with, probably looks a little bit confusing, but it will be clear in a second, quite typical ERP response, which is very good. This kind of shape that you get is usually what you get when you present people with words, or pseudo words for that matter. So good for us. It looks like a very typical by book, as we would say, experiment regarding that matter. But now what happens with our hypothesis? What happens with sound symbolism? Now, believe it or not, we recorded it pretty much in this brain region, so frontal left. So between 100 and 160 milliseconds, we are actually responding to sound symbolism effects. To us, this was really pretty impressive. So if we are still wondering whether we are using, this is just another way of presenting it. So these are words and these are pseudo words. So with words, you have this blob of activity. So this is 0, 100 milliseconds before presentation of stimuli, and then 900 milliseconds after presentation of stimuli. This is sound symbolic effect. So somewhere between or around 100 and 200 milliseconds, our brain is responding to sound symbolic congruencies. As I say, for us, or to us, this was quite impressive finding. And this is just answering the question is, what happens with sound symbolism in natural language? Do we rely on it? Are we picking up this information when we are talking to each other? Yes or no? Our intuitive response, as I told you before, would surely be not. However, oh yes, of course we are doing it. It's just that these kind of processes are happening on the brain level much quicker. So when we are talking to each other, when we are answering or even pressing buttons, we can't capture it. We need to have much more sophisticated methodologies in order to be able to recognize these kind of phenomena. So yes, ERP effect, sound symbolism effect, according to us, does exist even with the natural language, but it's very, very early ERP effect. Now, of course, the next stage, and something which would be much more interesting to this audience, would be, so what happens when you have two languages within the same brain? Or more languages for that matter. And to us, this is now a really interesting question, because if you speak two languages, if you hear lopta, but then also ball, does it actually even makes it even stronger for this effect to be obvious? My prediction would be yes. If you're relying on more languages, you have even stronger effect of sound symbolism because it goes, as I told you, across different languages. It's not only existing in one language, it's really like spread across. So if you have few languages, for starters, you will be certainly more sensitive to this, property of language which is there to help us processing really. So that's my prediction. However, I don't have experimental data to prove that yet. However, I have a student who was here in Novi Sad while I was lecturing here in Novi Sad 3 years ago. And she's now in San Sebastian working on bilingual brains, trying to find out what exactly is happening with sound symbolism within bilingual brains. Now, when it comes to polyglots, it's really not all that easy to capture these kind of works experimentally. And why so? Because it's really not easy to keep it controlled in the same way, and I'm sure you will understand that. So you can easily get people who are really fluent both in English and Serbian, for instance, or take any other combination, Romanian, Serbian, French and English, whatever. Matching the advance of the knowledge between two languages is much more easy than between a few languages, and especially it's hard to have people who have pretty much the same level of knowledge in a few languages. And in these kind of studies, we usually need like about 30 participants. So give me 30 polyglots which have equal amount of knowledge in 3 or 4 languages, that really makes it difficult. But at least we can have one step forward. Let's look at bilingual brains and see what happens. If it's promising, yeah, we'll make an effort. We'll make a step forward and try to recruit people with more languages activated at the same time or swapping between one another. So just before I move to the next example that I have, I wanted to give you now a chance to comment or ask the question regarding this part of the talk, and then I move on to my second example.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really interesting, but I have a question. How do you think your results would challenge more or less what's been thought in linguistics on the arbitrariness of the sign from the Saussurean point of view? That is my first question.
Can you say the second half of the question again, please?
Yeah, how would your results challenge the arbitrariness of the sign hypothesis?
Yeah,
And my second question is how to know when of the words you present or you use for your corpus studies are actually related to roundness or sharpness. What semantic properties do you take into account in order to classify these two types of words?
Thank you very much. So I truly believe that our data are calling into question theory of arbitrariness, very much so. I'm not saying that language is non-arbitrary system. I would definitely not say that. But I would definitely say that we are relying on sound symbolism effects in processing language. And actually we have more data, but I didn't have that much time to explain all of this, and especially because I entitled this talk as neural correlates of language. We have more data, and I'll actually give you some of that now. So in my opinion, what sound symbolism does is actually to help you learn the language. And there are now at least 2 laboratories, Oxford Baby Lab and Bangor Baby Lab, which are looking to see how many of those words that children are firstly acquired have actually these kind of correspondences, and also looking to see how much we as parents are exaggerating this when we are talking to our children. So when you're talking to your children, you would say veliki or big to actually stress that something is really large. Or you would say teeny tiny or small. We are actually really using this to help children learn, and they're relying on it. Even when they are talking, they would use these kind of expressions to actually help you better understand what they're talking about. So what I think is sound symbolism is there to help you kick off better with language. However, I'm absolutely sure that at some point you can't rely on it anymore, because it surely would become restricted, sort of to say. When you have a small vocabulary size, when you're starting to learn language, it's there to help you set off, sort of to say. And after that, it starts to diminish. And at the adult level, you saw it only in traces in the ERP signal very early on. That would be my sense. Now, regarding the set of the stimuli that we used, we have quite a few studies in which we were actually assessing what exactly people would produce and so on and so forth. There are also studies, again, I don't have enough time to tell you about all the other stuff that we did, but we were actually even asking people if if we present them with jaggedy or blobbly shape, what would exactly be the name that they would produce for it. Also, we would ask people to judge if there is a word for the object, how appropriate it is on a scale 1 to 7 and so on and so forth. So we have quite a few studies in which we are actually really tackling the appropriateness of, sort of to say, between the objects and their correspondences. And in this one, we were focusing on the shape. We didn't go for a size or something else. And in experimental framework, you can't ever capture anything. You're usually manipulating one thing in order to see the effect. But still, even with this, I think we are tackling the theory of sound symbolism. Sorry, it was a little bit longer answer, but I hope I clarified it. Any other question? Okay.
I'd like to ask a question myself. When you do the experiments with the blobbly or jagged words, have you tried that as well within different language groups? Say, for example, languages that have complicated consonant clusters, for example, where words just generally sound to a Latin ear or to even to an English-speaking ear, maybe into a Serbian-speaking area because you have more vowels in between the consonants.
Yeah.
Have you tried to see whether there's any disparity between the results?
Okay, so this is a really interesting question, and we did think about that, but not that far. I would love to talk to you more about this after the session is finished, but in general what we did is actually we presented Serbian population with English words and vice versa, and we still don't have data for this, and this is behavioral, not ERP studies, because ERP studies are just much more costly time-wise and in all different aspects, so we always start with behavioral. So there are some data, but we don't have results of this data yet. So if you're interested, I would be really happy to send you the results as soon as we analyze them. It won't be more than a week or two from this moment on. But clearly, what you're saying now, actually to tackle these specific languages would even be more interesting. And as I said, I would be more than happy to talk about that to you later.
Thank you.
Okay.
How
Do you want to scare me?
Yeah. How do you hope that your findings will innovate sort of the language education? Is this the part of the purpose? What ways do you see it innovating this education of language?
I would clearly say that something that we maybe do a lot as a parents, and probably are a little bit ashamed to do so when we are in a public environment, is something that you should and could exaggerate. So I would clearly advise with this data, well, I have to say, step back here and say I'm not a practitioner, I'm really not in education or anything like that. I'm really interested in what's happening in the brain. I'm, if you like, crazy scientist. But definitely there are connections with daily functioning. So in a kindergarten, if anyone was to ask me, I would clearly say, yes, do over-exaggerate shape, size, everything that you can for children, because they do rely on this, we know. And they're picking up on this even before they start to talk. So as I told you, there is this study, I think it's either 8 or 10-month-old babies who are showing similar correspondences. So if this is in place in the brain already, let's just take an advantage of it. And like when you take children in a kindergarten, of course, like when you're playing with them, why not exaggerate lopta? And you will notice when you're talking to really young children that they tend to look at mouth, shape of the mouth of the person when they're talking much more than adults. It actually reminds you a little bit of autistic children. But what they do is they really pick up the linguistic information which is being produced, articulatory information they're really acquiring and practicing by watching as well. So this is like stressing lopta, no problem, like do it. Why would you just say lopta and continue? And there are a number of studies which are looking into child-directed speech, and there are things which they say, like slow down when talking, repeat, and so on and so forth. This would definitely be, according to my research, one add-on thing for making it easier for them to acquire languages.
Isn't it very easy for kids to acquire languages? Yeah, sorry. Like, I think maybe what Robin was referring, like for us, not kids, maybe, I don't know. Like, like kids, I think it's, maybe you can speed it up, but anyway, they will pick it up. But for adults,
Surely.
like, would this be the same, like introducing?
I actually don't think so as much. Whoa, wait a second. You're thinking about when you're learning as an adult a foreign language. Clearly, yes. Similar to that, to this finding. So if I was to learn language that I don't speak, for instance, Spanish, I'm sure that you can help me in similar way. Over-exaggerate what you can to start with. Of course, do all the other stuff that people are recommending, slow down when talking and so on and so forth, repeat and so on. But yes, over-exaggerate, that would clearly help adult acquisition of a language as well. I misunderstood at the beginning because I just thought when you're well trained in a certain language, I don't think it helps more. But with a foreign language and starting to learn it even later on in life, I think the answer is the same. Okay? You're very welcome. Is it okay if I move on with my second example? And I'll try to rush it through it a little bit more because maybe we are over time. Organizers just warn me if we are overtaking time. Okay, so now I want to talk you through another example from our research, and this is to do with semantic organization. So at the beginning I told you that I'm very interested in language, and this is the topic in which I'm sort of maybe at least slightly interesting, even more so, because this is a bigger topic. This is how the knowledge is organized at the brain level. This is what semantic organization is about. And so, again, to start with an example, or again, experiment, why not? So if I were to ask you, which of the 3 objects you will relate to banana? Your answer would be, sorry, banana, to monkey. Oh. My bad. So which of the 3 objects you would relate to monkey? How many of you would say giraffe? Okay, how many of you would go for banana? Wow, okay, and I guess no one? Maybe there are specific associations, fine. Someone saw a monkey sitting on a bench somewhere, maybe would relate, but mainly this is what you get a result. However, this was really interesting, and I'll tell you why. Because what you demonstrated now massively is that you would actually go for thematic rather than taxonomic reasoning. And let me just now clarify the terms that I'm using, and then we move on to the background and my results. So taxonomic semantic organization refers to us being able to cluster objects which will belong to a same group. So for instance, we are talking about animals, or mammals more specifically. So for that reason, if we are organizing our knowledge that way, we would clearly group giraffe together with monkey, but then also cow and everything else. Similarly, we would group apple and pear and banana and so on as fruit. However, there is this other type of associations which you strongly demonstrated here, and that's thematic relationship. So 2 objects can be part of the same theme, part of the same scheme. They could be causally related, or they could be related in time or space and so on. So, for instance, monkey and banana are such example, or horse and saddle. They don't belong to the same cluster in terms of taxonomical organization, but still they are related. And if they are, when we are talking about them, there must be some kind of trace on the brain level as well, we thought. So now this is again not novel topic in psycholinguistics. There is research prior to what we did. So let's just give you a brief introduction, really brief introduction of what's done so far. So linguists and psycholinguists tend to talk a lot about this age shift, which is saying that as young kids, we start to use a lot of thematic organization and thematic relatedness. So in Serbian, we go for Vuk and Crvenkapa. Yeah? And these kind of examples, so wolf and what's...
Little Red Riding Hood.
Thank you. So you would relate things which do not relate, which do not belong actually to the same cluster a lot as a child. And then interestingly, just about the time when you start going to school, 6, 7 years old, at least in Serbian, this is the age, you shift to taxonomical organization more. So you would start to relate more fruits, put them together, or animals, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of literature talking about this thematic to taxonomic shift. However, there is also literature which says that if you belong to Anglo-Saxon population, you would be relying much more on taxonomic organization. So if I were to ask a French or English person, not sure about French, but certainly English people, for this kind of experiment, their response would heavily be giraffe and monkey. However, if you go east, so ask the same question to Chinese or Japanese people, they would massively go for monkey and banana and relate them together. So for us, it was really interesting to see what would happen in Serbian language, because when we are just talking about language, it clearly is more similar in many ways to English as opposed to Chinese in terms of characters and everything else. I guess for this population, I don't need to clarify why the similarity is bigger. So where do we position? My strong impression was that thematic would be actually a preferred system, but we just didn't have data for that. And the other thing, which is even more important, is I don't think that we should be actually contrasting this in a way that there is a cultural difference, that there is thematic to taxonomic shift. And one other thing that I didn't tell you about, there are also claims, for instance, in the big book of concept published by Murphy fairly recently, Greg Murphy, I guess at least some of you would know about him, they are talking that there is also this educational difference. So if you are educated, you would rely more on the taxonomic. If you are not, you would rely more on thematic. Really? I wasn't really convinced, and I really wanted to tackle this in the experimental framework. And also, my approach was like, don't put this one against the other when we talk about organization. Probably our brain is using benefits from both systems of organization, so why don't look at them as a complementary systems rather than competitive systems, sort of to say. So what we did in Serbian language was actually to run a number of behavioral and eye tracking studies as well. So what I presented to you before, we were presenting to our participants as well. So recognize here, they're really tiny, but now you know what these objects are. We would present participants auditorily with monkey and ask them to look freely at the picture presented. So these are eye tracking studies. Again, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with eye tracking system, so I'll just briefly say. Eye tracking system involves the system which has like a camera attached in front of your eyes in sort of helmet, and also has a source of infrared light which is reflecting from your retina, so that you can actually capture at every single moment. I'm simplifying story again. I'm happy to talk about the methodology more if anyone interested. Basically, millisecond by millisecond, again, you can trace where exactly we are looking at. So this is very helpful when you want to know how people are reading, how people are processing on a daily basis information, or really in this kind of experiments. So rather than getting people to say, as I asked you, which one would you choose, which is really more strategic response, we wanted to see what's happening when you have more automated response. Automated the response. You got me, I'm sure. So what happens when you don't have chance to think and answer, but when you immediately need to look and skim through what's presented to you? So this is what we did. Visually, but then also we presented only words to participants. And finally, we did a strategic experiment, which I did with you, but of course, much smaller proportion, because in these kind of experiments, we always have at least 50, 60 triads of stimuli presented to our participants. So what happens with the results of our studies? To start with, this is eye tracking that I was telling you about. So the camera, which help us determine where exactly this person is looking at every single moment. And so these gray bars refer to thematic. Then you have taxonomic in light gray bars and non-related. So this would be basically banana, related to monkey, right? This would be giraffe, and this would be bench. So what we find with eye tracking experiments, using number of measures. So first look, total looking time, number of fixations they make. Now maybe I'm using some words that you don't know, but when you have eye tracking studies, you have these jumps of eye movements and then also little falls. So our eyes are not skimming, although it seems like that, through the surface continuously. They are making jumps. And when they make a jump, nothing much is happening brain-wise. When they actually land on a surface, this is when we are processing information. So when we are talking about total looking time, this is how many of these fixations you made, how long they lasted, where exactly was this first fixation. This is what we were after in this study. Now, I apologize if I'm telling things that you're familiar with, but I just wanted to be on the same page with everyone here. So this is what we got. We got a strong preference, and I'm only showing one measure here, and it's really through all the measures that we used in experiment very similar. Serbian population clearly prefers thematic organization. And I need to just tell you that this population was educated adults. So no, they are not under 6, 7. They are educated. They are university students, academics. And still, yet, they show what you just demonstrated me before. I found this really interesting because when I was at Oxford Uni, there was this lecture when I first discovered about this phenomenon, and there were 2 Chinese people in population and all the others were English. And when professor asked similar example, it was maybe apple, worm, and something else, actually only 2 Chinese people went for thematic and everyone else went for taxonomic organization, which was truly impressive to see. This is when I got interested in this data. Now, what you demonstrated today was quite opposite to what I'm telling you now. And so when we did the strategic experiment that I've showed you just now, and behavioral data are what we have heavily reported in Anglo-Saxon population, not ERP, not eye tracking. We are the first ones who are doing it. So far, we mainly have behavioral data, and they're showing us strong taxonomic preference in Anglo-Saxon population. What happens in these kind of experiments with Serbian population? Surprisingly, it looks as if there would be a difference between thematic and taxonomic, but no, statistically this is a straight line. They do not differ regarding reaction times. However, interestingly enough, when we looked at the mistakes that participants make, it was really interesting to see when you ask people to give you a taxonomic preference, they give you a thematic one. So they prefer thematic much more than taxonomic, sort of to say, even behaviorally. So finally, we really wanted to see what's happening at the brain level as well. Again, we are using our good old fellow methodology, ERP, that I already introduced you to. And now I just need to introduce you to one further component before I present my final 2 slides. And this is to do with N400 effect. Now, this effect is very well recorded in the literature from 70s, 80s onwards. And this is to say, when you have semantically congruent information, there will be not so much activity on a brain level around N400 component. If there is an incongruency, there will be much more activity, sort of to say. So look at this example here. The sentence goes like, the pizza was too hot to eat. Nothing much is happening around 400 milliseconds, so it's negative peak, and it happens around 400 milliseconds from the onset of the verb that people are listening to. Now, when you make a semantic mistake and you go, the pizza was too hot to drink, well, you made a mistake, well, not huge, but there is a mistake and your brain is responding to this. See, it makes this whoop, blob, jump, around 400 milliseconds from the moment you presented the word. However, if you really make a mistake and make something, say something that really makes no sense, such as the pizza was too hot to cry, and then your brain really goes like, what? It's really big surprise. It is like that. N400 really captures very well gradually what's happening in terms of semantic integration. If there is a match, no problem at all. We go on. But you do get surprised when there is a mismatch, of course, and this is clearly demonstrated in the experiment. So we love these results, N400, and we thought, fantastic. This is exactly the framework that we can use for our studies with thematic and taxonomic organization. We can present people with thematic pairs, with taxonomic pairs, with the match and with total mismatch, and see what's happening. You see where I'm heading? What would be our prediction? We would predict that our brains would be much less surprised with thematic mismatch when you go for combination like monkey and banana, rather than when you go monkey and giraffe, right? So if you promise people to show them, you prime them with monkey, and then you show banana, they would be much less surprised than when you prime them with monkey and then you go for giraffe. This was our prediction based on the data that I showed you before. And it would be truly interesting if we could demonstrate that on a neural level as well, that it's not only behavioral, it's not strategic, but it's really automatic and well-documented component N400, as I say. So what we got? As I told you, here I'm using different examples, but doesn't matter. As I told you, in these experiments, we always have many more examples rather than one. We have to. So here you have a cow, which is either you present participants with krava or cow, and then you show cow. Or you present a donkey as a word, and then you show the cow, and then milk. Now you will recognize that milk is thematically related to cow, and donkey is taxonomically related to cow. And similarly, we had, of course, this triad that I used before, and then apple, worm, pear, all these kind of pairs. And so what happens with our data? Again, similar set of electrodes that we use. Again, I introduced you to this, so I won't repeat myself. And this is what we got. Yay! Amazing. What we got exactly was what we expected. So this is total match. So this is monkey, monkey. Okay. The next one, do you want to guess? You have 3 options: monkey banana, monkey giraffe, monkey bench. Monkey banana. This is thematic. So there is surprise, but not as much as you have taxonomic or non-related mismatch. Now this is really interesting. Taxonomic actually is quite equal to total mismatch, whereas thematic is much closer, much more closer, and statistically more closer to the match. So what we are demonstrating here is that really at the brain level, our brain differentiates a lot between thematic and taxonomic match. And we conclude from here that semantically, it's much more easier to integrate thematically related pairs rather than taxonomically related pairs. So, sort of to say, it's really not fair to say that it's taxonomic organization which is default, as we have recorded from most of the Anglo-Saxon literature, mainly English population so far. And this is really calling into question what happens with semantic organization worldwide and in different languages. Now, this is a paper which we submitted a few months ago and just got a positive feedback, so soon it will be published as well. But now this is just like hot out of press, what I'm showing you here. A different way, as before, to showing it is if you actually subtract match from taxonomic, you get like a lot of activity going on around N400, no surprise, but much less activity going on when you subtract thematic from mismatch. And again, of course, thematic and taxonomic differ a lot. So what we conclude from here is that we believe that thematic and taxonomic systems are both active and they are both complementary. However, that at least in Serbian population, thematic is much easier to process. Now, again, what's more interesting, I guess, to this population is, again, what happens when you have two languages or more languages to interplay. And so what we are doing now are two studies. Together with our colleagues from the University of Bangor from Wales, they're replicating exactly the same ERP study that I've told you about just now. So they want to see, when using exactly the same stimuli, whether we would have a switch between thematic and taxonomic with English population. Do you see what I mean? I'll just quickly go back to the to this line. So what we are predicting would happen if it truly is the case that English people rely more on taxonomic, you would have switch. This one would drop down and taxonomic would go up, right? So that would be prediction. I kind of really don't think that this is happening. I really think that thematic organization is very natural to us, and it's much easier for the brain to pick up. And I just think that it's really not well represented in the literature, because it's not fair to say it is to do with education, it is to do with age, and so on. I just don't think that the studies that we use so far are capturing well enough what's happening in terms of semantic organization at the brain level. Yes, I know we are telling a big story, but at least with this first publication we are successful, right? Reviewers recognized it. So just to conclude, the other thing that will be soon running in Serbian population is actually to have Serbian speakers of Serbian, of course, but then also of English language, and then we'll be seeing whether there is shift between these two languages when they're processing thematic and taxonomic. I doubt it will happen. I really think that we will actually get even stronger evidence to support thematic organization being quite natural and quite present at the brain level. So I think no matter if you're Serbian, doesn't matter whether you process monkey banana or maimun banana, you would do the same brain-wise. You would rely more on thematic organization. That's my gut instinct, but we'll see what happens. So that's next step. And as I told you, ideally, we would do it even with more languages and very distinct languages, of course, from Serbian and from English. But that's, as I said, quite difficult or more difficult to do experimentally, because you need to have 20, 30 people who speak 3 languages up to the same level somewhere near Belgrade so that I can get them into my lab to do ERPs. It's a little bit challenging, but we'll see. Maybe we go down into that direction as well. So I would really like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very open to hear more comments and questions from your side.